BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, and thanks for joining us for the Farming Today podcast. I'm Kaz Graham, and in this episode, the UK-EU summit flagged as a post-Brexit reset. But for some fishing businesses, it's too little, too late.
The industry is never going to be the same again. I don't know why they're even discussing it, because there isn't a business left to discuss.
We'll have more from Cornwall a little later in the programme. First, though, bovine TB is an infectious respiratory cattle disease, but its impact is so much greater than sick cows with a cough. Each year, more than 40,000 cattle are slaughtered across the UK in an effort to get rid of it. The wider bovine TB eradication programme, things like culling and badger vaccinations, costs UK taxpayers around £150 million a year, with more costs falling to the cattle industry. And of course, you can't put a neat figure on the impact on the mental health of farmers whose cattle are affected, counting down the days between tests and seeing their cows culled. Well, we're going to take a close look at bovine TB all this week. The different parts of the UK have different approaches to tackling the disease, and we'll be hearing from Northern Ireland and Wales later on. But we start in England, where there's been a decade-long programme of enhanced cattle testing, increased biosecurity and culling badgers, which can catch and pass on bovine TB. The government promised to end what it described as the ineffective badger cull in its manifesto, and says it's now working at pace on a revised TB eradication strategy. Professor James Wood is a veterinary epidemiologist from the University of Cambridge. He told me that over the last few years, the overall rates of the disease in cattle have been coming down in England, but it's hard to tell how much of that decline is down to badger culling.
When you look at the published statistics and the way they've been analysed, it's impossible to distinguish all of the effects of badger culling from the way that badger culling was rolled out with enhanced cattle testing. But what's clear overall is that there's been a significant effect of the enhanced cattle testing and the badger culling combined with overall improved biosecurity in those cull areas. If you look just at the first 3 culls where they were rolled out before that enhanced cattle testing was introduced as well, they were also associated with some significant reductions in disease. So I think we can be clear that it's highly likely that badger culling has played an important role in this reduction, but you can't overall say how much of it was badger culling and how much of it was the enhanced cattle testing.
And it's a highly politicised debate with people on both sides saying that the data will back up their argument that either the cull is or the cull isn't working. You are a member of the government's Bovine TB partnership. What does the data tell us? Are you able to get a kind of unbiased answer from the data?
I think that, one of the huge complications with this is that the two sides of this argument will look at the same numbers, and one will say badger culling has been fundamentally important, and the other side says badger culling has had no effect whatsoever, just from looking at the same stats. And this has dogged the whole debate around bovine TB control for 20 or 30 years now. I think personally that there is evidence that the badger culling is associated with a decline in the rates of disease in cattle. But it's because of the way that these control programs, you don't do just one thing at a time and then carefully evaluate it. You're trying to do all of the right things at the same time. It's really hard to be absolutely specific about how big any of these effects are.
In the run-up to the last election, the Labour Party manifesto said that they were going to end what they called the ineffective badger cull. And that line, it caused a whole lot of concern amongst some farmers. But that hasn't actually happened as yet. Cull licences have been granted since they came into power. Do you know what's going to happen with that?
I think that there aren't going to be any new cull licences issued from now on, but the culls that have started will be completed. But I think that we will see an end to badger culling before the end of this current Parliament.
OK. DEFRA says that a new approach is going to include boosting cattle testing. I mean, you were talking earlier about how improved testing and increased testing had been positive. Why is that so useful?
Well, one of the huge problems with this disease is that it's very hard to find the early disease in cows. So soon after they get infected, some cows will go positive in the standard skin test that's used for the detection of the disease, but not all cattle will. But if you use different tests, and some of them are the blood tests that were used alongside the badger culling, then you have a far better rate of detection. And it's really important that we use every one of the tests that we have at our disposal to try and clear out the infection from herds once we know it's there. And I think we can do more of that than we have done and than we are doing at the moment. And so I think that this new policy with enhanced cattle testing can be really quite beneficial.
I mean, some of the other measures used to tackle bovine TB are biosecurity on farms and also vaccinating badgers. Do we know how much difference these other measures make? Or again, can you just not differentiate between them?
Well, for all animal diseases, biosecurity plays a central role in disease control. So anything that we can do to separate infected animals from the rest, and that could include infected cattle or indeed infected badgers. The issues around badger vaccination, I mean, it's really likely that badger vaccination can have a very positive impact in the long term in specific areas if you can do it at a high enough rate. The huge challenge would be trying to roll out badger vaccination over such a huge area.
The great hope for tackling this disease is a cattle vaccine, and you're involved in the research in this area. The background here is that there is a vaccine available, but that the test we currently use to tell whether cows are infected with TB can't distinguish between an infected animal and a vaccinated animal, which means that we can't safely use the vaccine. So really, the work is all about to check if a different test, which can tell the difference, this test is called a DIVA test, is effective. First of all on that, does the cattle vaccine work?
I think one of the things that is really exciting and new information that's come out in the last 2 or 3 years is work that we've been doing with fantastic collaborators in Ethiopia, where we've got far greater scope for doing experimentation with this sort of thing in cattle. And here we demonstrated that the cattle vaccine is absolutely brilliant at reducing transmission between cows. So that if you've got a totally vaccinated herd of cattle, the overall efficacy of the vaccine could be up to 80%. What we really need new information now on is the DIVA test.
And there are actually government field trials here in the UK using the vaccine alongside this DIVA test. Can you tell me where they've got to?
They are going to start the third phase of those, and that work, I think we all hope, will be done within a year or two. So that straight after that, we can hopefully start trying to use the vaccine, providing the test appears good enough in those field trials.
And how much difference would it make to actually have the cattle vaccine working here? I mean, would that solve the bovine TB problem?
We will need to roll out cattle vaccination alongside continued other measures. So making sure that we're testing cattle and removing infection from the herds at the earliest possible stages. So I think it's going to be a game changer, but it's not going to be a silver bullet.
Professor James Wood, and we'll have more on bovine TB all through this week. Now, Sir Keir Starmer will be welcoming EU leaders to London later today for a summit that aims to improve cooperation and reset relations in a post-Brexit world. Those in food, farming and fishing will have their fingers crossed. It'll lead to a long-awaited veterinary agreement that will cut red tape and costs that have had a severe effect on trade in food products, everything from seed potatoes to lamb to cheese. Since we formally left the EU in January 2021, the UK has been classed as what's called a third country trader, with food exports subject to new rules and associated costs, inspections and bureaucracy that are thought to have cost hundreds of millions of pounds. Fishing quotas are being talked about as a possible deal breaker. The EU will want to retain access for its boats to the 6 to 12 mile fishing limit around our coast, whereas UK fishermen are hoping to see them finally excluded. Leaving the EU has had a huge impact on some UK fishing businesses, which is why industry leaders are adamant that their interests shouldn't be bartered away as part of a deal. For some, the reset has come too late, as BBC South West's Lucy Fisher reports from Cornwall.
Martin Leahy recently sold his oyster export business in Flushing after a lifetime spent in the industry.
Every day you come here, you realise, right, I'm not part of this anymore. You know, this isn't mine anymore.
He blames the paperwork needed following Brexit.
You don't sleep the night you've sent a load away. You just don't know whether it's going to pass the next day. And for a small business, losing a consignment is close to total wipeout, you know.
EU leaders are meeting in London to try and strike a new deal. Rumours are that export paperwork could be reduced in return for continued access to UK waters. A fresh seawater tank arrives at the site along with the new owner, Paul Blewett. He also owns a fishing fleet. Would that deal help him?
I'm 70, so does it matter? I finished, but for the youngsters, I don't know. The industry is never going to be the same again. You go to any of the ports, you go to Newlyn, look at Mevagissey, Lou, Padstow, Port Isaac doesn't exist, Boscastle doesn't exist anymore. It's just finished, there is nothing left. I don't know why they're even discussing it, because there isn't the business left to discuss.
Or just putting them over there.
Some of those young fishermen are Tom and Matilda.
With everything that's making fishing harder and the sort of spatial squeeze and the pressure that fishermen are under, the 6 to 12 would buck that trend and be so vital for keeping the industry going.
It would give something for these young fishermen to work harder for and see a success within their career.
Chris Ramford, Chief Executive Officer of the Cornish Fish Producers Organisation. The UK government's hand once on this, and it's raising a lot of concern. We know what the EU are after. We know that they want access or multi-year access into UK waters. That shows the value of fishing inside UK waters. But we haven't heard anything about what the UK government are actually putting up to support the UK fishing industry on.
Lucy Fisher reporting there. And we will, of course, be reporting tomorrow on what the summit means for fishing, food and farming. But that's it from us for today. I'm Kaz Graham. The producer is Rebecca Rooney. And the programme is a BBC Audio Bristol production. Time now for the Farming Today 5-day forecast from the BBC Weather Centre.